Hello! I hate mobile games, generally mostly because of the terrible controls and the screen size. But I do like the portability aspect. So I always had this idea for a mobile RPG where most of the action, like combat and exploration, is automatic. But the only thing you do actively is manage your character's build. Pilgrim is that game. Well, kinda. Pilgrim is an open source idle game, a MMORPG, Diablo text adventure hybrid, that you play by messaging a Telegram bot, which is convenient, because that way you didn't have to make a user interface. And I only had to focus on the backend stuff, like server and the database and stuff like that. But we'll get to that later. Before getting technical though, let's look at how the game actually works, to give you some context. Pilgrim is an entirely text-based game, or as I like to say, a texting-based game, since you play it by messaging with a Telegram bot. Despite of this, or because of this, the game has a lot of mechanics. On a basic level, what you do is just wait for your character to finish your quests. Various leveled zones. During this quest, your character can encounter events, quick time events, monsters to fight, and even players to meet and interact with. And of course, find loot, which is the main point of the game. If your HP reaches 0 at any point during the quest and your inventory doesn't have any revives in them, you will die and fail the quest. You can still fail the quest even if you get to the end of the quest, if you fail the final roll, which is influenced by various stats of your character. Which brings us to the character sheets. You can access the character sheets by typing the command check player or check stats. I will not explain what each stat does, since we will be here for 2 hours if I do that, since the game has a lot of mechanics, as I said. But here's a quick look at my character stats. As you can see, I am pretty strong. I'm really not, actually, but this is my video. The world in which the game takes place is called Boron, and it is a mixture between Warhammer 40k and Bloodborne. Although the lore mostly follows the rule of cool, so don't think too much about it. If you're interested in it though, and you are since this is my video, the gist of it is that there used to be a god emperor that ruled everything, and that at some point was mysteriously killed by some unknown forces. So the empire crumbled. Eldritch beings took over everything in the empire except for one safe haven, which is Pilgrim's Rest, the game's town, where you smith, you upgrade and do all that stuff. You play as an adventurer bound by the Ouroboros contract, a pact you've made with an eldritch being, which lets you resurrect when dying, at the cost of being forced to wander for eternity for the entertainment of said eldritch being. The eldritch being is supposed to be you, by the way, the player. I love meta stuff, it's great. Anyway, all the lore is an excuse I made up to send players on infinite quests in cool zones that I made up. How are the quests infinite? Well, the secret is... Yes, I know, people nowadays don't like it, but trust me, it makes sense here. Pilgrim uses AI for a lot of systems in the game. Basically, it's used to make the world more interesting to explore and more consistent. It's basically a really fancy way to generate new content dynamically. If you look inside the Pilgrim module and open the generics.py file, we find a class called Pilgrim Generator, which shows all the things that Pilgrim does using LLMs, as shown here. Well, here all the methods are empty because, it's a generic class, but the implementation that the game uses actually has methods in it. Trust me. Anyway, as you can see, Pilgrim uses AI to generate quests, events, which are the descriptions of what your character is doing in quests, artifacts, enemies, and anomalies. All the prompts I used to generate the things I mentioned, except for artifacts, is a zone description as its context. Quests and events are fairly self-explanatory. For quests, I tell the AI to generate a quest title, a quest description, a quest success description, and a quest failure description, which are used depending on if you fail or succeed the quest. Inverted. For events, I just tell the AI to write some stuff that happens in the quest without giving it specific directions. Artifacts are quite neat, actually. They're basically unique numbered things that you can craft using a special in-game currency, artifact pieces, which is pretty rare. Each artifact is AI generated and completely unique. It's also given a unique ID, a unique number, and a name and a description. And you can even check which artifacts belong to which players. So each player has their own artifacts and they're all shared in the game. For example, I have the 123rd artifacts and some others, as you could see before. Enemies are what you can fight during quests, obviously. And I tell the AI to generate a name, a description, a victory text, and a failure, a defeat text. Which you'll see depending on if you kill the monster or if the monster kills you. Anomalies are basically weekly zone modifiers that change every week depending on, when the day, and they also apply to different zones, depending to which zone the AI decided to apply the modifier to. This is all entirely AI generated. It's basically your AI machine overlord trying to control your adventure. For full disclosure, the current implementation uses ChatGPT 4 Mini as the backend to spend less money because I want to not spend too much money on this. But the interface is generic enough to be implemented using a locally run LLM, like for example something with Llama or what is it called? The one with the Chinese one, DeepSeek, right? Basically, you could use anything you want if you want to to program an interface yourself. You can even do a version of Pilgrim that doesn't have AI at all. The current generator works in batches, which means it runs once every few hours and it checks if it has actually stuff to generate. And if it does have stuff to generate, it generates everything in batches and then saves it to the database and keeps it for future reference. For example, the generator will generate 5 more quests and 25 new events and 10 monsters if it sees that a player has reached the final quest of the zone. So yeah, that's how it works. Pilgrim is an MMO, and fun fact about MMOs, they're basically playable databases, and Pilgrim is no different. To handle everything, I chose to use an ORM instead of using raw SQL, since it's a cleaner solution in code, and it should be the industry standard. I say should because I do work for an actually big tech corporation, and guess what? We use raw SQL. Anyway, this is one of the worst parts of the project in hindsight. I just didn't set stuff up properly and used the niche library to implement the ORM, Pwin, which I'm sure it's a great library if you use it correctly, but I didn't, so it just gave me more problems than it solved in the end. That said, everything still works, and I managed to wrangle Pwin to do whatever I wanted it to do, even if I had to resort to trial and error sometimes to, solve some undocumented problem with the library. Anyway, I won't cover every single function since it would be pointless, and there are literally more than 40 functions in the database. But let me just tell you about some cool things about the game, about how I save things in the database. First cool thing, compression. While I'm not using actual compression, most data-intensive things in the game, like equipment metadata and perks, are extremely compressed to save space. Taking said perks as an example, I use binary strings to save them in just 6 bytes. So a single perk occupies 6 bytes. This is because I use a 16-bit integer for unsigned integer for the ID of the perk, and a 32-bit unsigned integer for the strength of the perk, and from these two values I can make perks dynamically at runtime. Doing this lets me save literally thousands of bytes of space, and I can save literally tens of thousands of items of equipment in database for less than 100 kilobytes of space. Second cool thing, caches. Pilgrim is a fundamentally real-time database, as we said before, that you access through a command line, and to keep it fast and performant, I just used a bunch of caches that are fine-tuned through function decorators, which is a really handy way to add additional functionality to functions. And as you can see here, I love this style of coding, it is pretty cool, and I even implemented thread safety for updates using this same style of coding. Third cool thing, fake tables. Some tables in the database aren't tables at all. They're just runtime procedurally generated lists of items that change based on different values, like, for example, the list of available items to buy as Miffy, or at the market. This allows me to reuse the already existing interfaces that I made for the database without actually having to make new models and build new tables, which saves a lot of time, as you can imagine. Database is only half the story. The other half is managers. They're basically persistent objects that live on different threads that handle the idle part of Pilgrim. For example, events, combat, players meeting, quest generation, and everything in between. As you can see here, a generic manager only has one method, which lets it acquire the database. Every manager does wildly different things. For example, let's take a look at the most complex manager of them all, the quest manager. The entry point, here, is the run method. It basically just checks if any players have any pending updates, and if they do, it processes them. Meanwhile, it adds those players to a dictionary that maps set players to the zone they're in. And this data structure is then used to handle player meetings. Anyway, let's look at the core of this specific manager, the process update method. First of all, the manager checks if the player is on a quest at all. If they are not, it just sends a generic town event, a random town event. There are thousands of them, which tells the player what their character is doing in town. Like, I don't know, running errands and stuff like that. If the player is on a quest, however, it then checks all the player flags and acts accordingly. For example, if the player is on a raid, then the manager will process the gigantic 20 versus 20 combat that the raid usually is, and return. If the player is hunting for monsters to catch, then the manager will spawn a catch event and tell the player how the catch went, if the player actually caught the monster and made them their pet, slave, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. If the player is supposed to be finishing a quest, the manager will do all the calculations that entail finishing a quest, and then tell the player if they failed the quest or completed it, and so on. With this one manager, most of the game system are implemented, but then there are other managers that do other things. For example, the generator manager implements the iGenerator, as you can see here. The tourney manager handles the guild tourneys, that are like bi-weekly tourneys that are reward players and with various things depending on their place in the tourney. Anyway, and then, for example, the handling of notifications by the notification manager. Like every good Diablo-like game, Pilgrim revolves around the loot you can find. Each item can have a bunch of perks on it, the amount depends on the item, and the perks go from giving you a flat percentage increase in damage to giving you a resurrection once per fight to full health. You can equip almost 7 items on characters, and all the perks on all the items stack. So you can imagine what kind of broken builds the community came up with. There was a guy that once did more than 1 billion damage with a single attack. It was insane and really imbalanced. I nerfed that. Anyway, let's look at how the loot is generated in the code. The first thing that the code does is saving the seed, which is the time. And it saves it so that it can be reused later to generate the same item, instead of saving the item stats on the database. This is a space-saving measure, basically. Then an item type is chosen randomly between more than 100 item types. Yes, Pilgrim has a lot of item types. It can range from a longsword to a ballista to fishnets or a hat, a normal hat. You know, there's a lot of variation. Then damage and resist values are generated, depending on whether the item is a weapon or an armor. At most, an item can have 1 to 3 resist or damage values, like piercing, electric, or fire, you know, all those. There's 8, but an item can have at most 3. Then a list of perks, which internally are called modifiers, are generated. And however many are generated depends on the item rarity. It is very similar to how Diablo chooses affixes, and the rarity of each individual perk isn't determined by the rarity of the item, just the amount. So if a 2-star item doesn't have like legendary perks, it just has 2 perks. You know, stars equals the perks, the amount of perks. Finally, a name is generated by randomly choosing from the relevant string pool of adjectives between weapon modifiers or armor modifiers. The choice is based on the damage or resist values chosen in the damage and resist generation step, and can lead to things like Flaming Longsword of Thunder. You know, it sounds cool. It works pretty well. I'm pretty proud of that. And there it is. That's how every item is generated in Pilgrim. Hopefully you can see the Diablo comparisons, as the itemization is kind of similar to an action RPG, except the combat is turn-based instead of real-time. And yeah, that's it. This allows the game to have a variety of items. Here are some examples. Items can be re-rolled and re-enchanted and tempered also. So you can, the item you get is not final. You know, you can add more enchantments, you have perks, you can maybe get it to an higher level, you can sell it too, you know, you can do whatever you want with your items. You have 50 inventory spaces to fill. Go wild. More than 650 commits and 40,000 lines of code later, at this point it feels like there's nothing else I can really add to the game without making fundamental changes to the structure of the game itself. As usual, if I were to start again, I'd do a lot of things differently, such as making everything in the game event-based from the beginning, instead of adding an event system halfway through the development of the game. It got messy, got really messy in the end, because Pilgrim was originally supposed to be a way smaller and simpler game than it became. Because, you know, once players started playing the game, they started making requests and, you know, new features were added without really thinking too much about it. For example, guild bonuses are just if statements scattered throughout the code. Perks are an actual event system with, you know, events and conditions and stuff like that. Vocations, which are the Pilgrim version of classes, are a completely different system again. So these 3 systems that interact with each other have 3 completely different implementations, which I would avoid now if I were to make the game again, by making some kind of unified system from the beginning. Another thing I would do differently, as I already said, is the database. My choice of library, Pee-wee, wasn't exactly great. Didn't really limit my vision, but it also made things harder to implement. Nothing against the library itself, I just didn't use it right, apparently. Anyway, I would use something like SQL Alchemy right now, since it's more established and documented than Pee-wee. Overall though, I am pleased with how the game turned out in the end, and even if the code is a bit of a mess. I did have fun working on it and torturing players by adding some borderline sadistic things, like the sanity mechanic, which some players have some very intimate encounters with. Don't hunt too much, or you will become the prey. That's all I'm gonna say. Anyway, having said all that, I do have a few ideas for something set in the Pilgrim universe, maybe made with Godot. We will see about that, I guess. If you want to play Pilgrim, you can talk to the bot shown on screen right now, and you can find the code on my GitHub page, linked in the description, which also includes instructions how to deploy your own version of Pilgrim if you want to deploy your own version, play on your private bot. I've watched way too many YouTube programming videos mainly to fall asleep, generally, but I like them, and also while I eat. And I wanted to make my own to, try my hand at this. I like those, so, I want to make my own. Tell me how I can improve in any way, and yeah, thanks for watching and have a nice day.